This video was sponsored by Bespoke Post.
Hey, welcome to another video. This one gets a little crazy, I'm not gonna lie. My friend Michael Alm from Alm Fabs, he's on YouTube, somewhere up in there. Anyways, he showed up at my shop. He was only gonna be here for 5 days and we wanted to build something. So naturally, we did what any two woodworkers would do in the span of 5 days. We decided to build a boat. Start to finish, zero plans, zero forethought, just a blurry picture we found on a Google image search. So yeah, this is one of those videos where it could be a horrible, terrible disaster, but you're just gonna have to watch and find out. So enjoy the video, follow along, and remember, we're not boat builders. We're just making this up as we go along, so don't be too hard on us, all right? Okay, roll the little flying moth thing in the jig.
White snow, red sky, reach out for so high. Blue eyes, fake cry, beware of the fox tonight.
Meet my friend Michael Alm. He's terrible with the super dramatic intros, but he is a great woodworker and has an awesome channel. You should check it out. This is the direction we're going.
Yeah, cafe racer. No, cafe...
Cocktail.
Cocktail.
Cocktail
Cocktail
boat.
racer.
Okay, so tomorrow's the 6th.
Yeah.
So I think our goal for tomorrow should be to cut out all of our internal ribs. This seems like it's going to be way better now because we can just use full stock. There will be zero scarfing, zero laminating.
Try and get everything out of 4x8.
Yeah, there'll be a lot more like tinkering and figuring out angles, but it's all out of just stock pieces of plywood. Well, that was it. Literally the only conversation we had before we started building this boat. We had zero plans. All we had was a blurry image we found on Google image search, and we decided to get going. The first thing we had to do was determine the size and shape we wanted our boat to be. So we got 2 pieces of scrap 1/4-inch white oak ply, and we just clamped them on top of my workbenches. Yeah, that kind of looks like a boat. Once we had the general shape we wanted, we took some measurements. For the length, I hopped in there to get the total height. I mean, we do have to fit inside this thing. And we took one more look at the Google image search. See this picture here? Yeah, that's the closest thing to plans we have to build this entire boat. While we were on the internet, I also hopped on Amazon and I bought the only outboard motor that could get delivered within 2 days. We're on a bit of a time crunch, so it's the only thing we could get. A whopping 3.6 horsepower Fun Chick. What? You never heard of a Fun Chick outboard motor before? Yeah, me neither. We'll just have to pray that it works. With our general shape laid out, we started taking measurements for each one of our individual ribs. I didn't know if this is the right thing to do or not, but it seemed like a good place to start, and we got this glorious looking plan here showing us the total measurement for all 6 of our ribs as well as our transom. With our measurements nailed down, we took down our plywood little bendy mold thing, and it was time to get cutting. To build this entire project, we are using marine grade Akume ply, Tiger ply to be exact. Tiger Ply is a new brand of plywood. They specialize in Akume marine grade, and their stuff is awesome. They use phenolic resin to glue all of their laminated sheets together, so it stands up great to moisture. And all of their individual layers inside the ply is a full veneer, meaning no voids, no gaps, no fillers. This plywood was wonderfully donated by the Hardwood Center, which is a local establishment near me. If you live in the Willamette Valley or anywhere in Oregon for that matter, I highly suggest you look them up and buy their plywood. They are great. The first thing we wanted to do was cut all of our ribs into individual pieces. Now we wanted to give them a little curve on the top, so I hammered in a few nails and we used those same pieces of 1/4-inch ply to trace out an arc on the top of our first rib. It's actually our transom. Then I took a little piece of 1/4 inch and I went over to the bandsaw and I rounded over the edge. We're going to use this as a template to give each side of our rib a nice little curve as well. Then I took that little template back over to our piece of 3/4 inch Akume ply and I used it to trace a nice curved line on both sides of our first piece. Like I said, this is going to be the transom, and then we'll just start cutting out ribs, working our way from the back to the front. I don't know if this is right, but it's the way we're going to do it. After we got the size and shape traced onto the plywood, I let Michael cut it out with a jigsaw. Mostly because if it's messed up, then I can blame him, and I don't have to take the fall for anything. But I did help by hosing the whole thing down with some compressed air so he could follow his line nice and easily. With our transom piece cut out, I pulled out the track saw, cut a fresh, clean, sharp, straight edge on the ply, and then it was time to repeat the process all over again. We've got 6 ribs plus the transom, so we're going to need 7 support pieces. With the transom cut out, we decided to use it to roughly trace the shape and arc of our next piece. Of course, we have to bring it in each piece to get a little smaller and smaller as we go. A fun little tip I learned from Mike in doing this is that if you score your line with a razor blade before you cut it with a jigsaw, it pretty much eliminates all tear out. So I let him keep cutting things out with the jigsaw, and I was hard at work on more of the planning, facilitating aspect of the build. But each time he got a piece cut out, I was right behind him with the track saw to cut a nice straight edge. Now all of our ribs will get smaller and smaller in height as well, but we decided to leave them all the same height to start with so that we could lay them out on the table and get all of our curves figured out before we cut them down. Somewhere along the road, we decided there just wasn't enough of a curve on the top of the boat. So we added a bit more of a curve to our first transom piece, then using that piece as a template, we matched that curve on all of the remaining pieces as we went. Just sticking the transom down with a little double-sided tape and running it through the router table with a top bearing mounted upcut, downcut, flush, trim, bit, thingamabob. And we just kept doing this over and over again until all of our rib pieces were cut to size and had a nice curve on the top that was matchy-matchy. Next, we had to figure out a way to lay out all of our ribs in the proper orientation. So we grabbed another piece of scrap 1/4 inch white oak ply and we clamped it to my work surface. Then we took a chalk line and put a center line right down the middle of that piece of 1/4 inch ply. Next, we just took a bunch of scrap blocks and using some CA glue and the accelerator spray, we glued a block on either side of our ribs. Note, we did not glue these blocks to the ribs, we glued them to the 1/4 inch ply just to hold our ribs in place. This would allow us to put our ribs in and out of this little handy jig as we needed, and they were all lined up perfectly and evenly spaced. Next, we had to start figuring out the overall curve of our vessel. So in order to do this, we just took some scrap pieces of 1/4 inch stock that were nice and bendy and decided just to tack them on the outside of our ribs with a 23 gauge brad nailer. This way we could pull them off when we needed and it wouldn't scar up the ribs too bad. So I tacked one side on and then tacked the other side on. When we got to the front, we realized we had to trim down our little pieces of scrap so they would meet nice and uniform at the front. So I did this quick and easy with a little Japanese pole saw. Then we just taped them together to hold them in place. In tacking this little bendy piece on, we quickly realized that each one of our ribs was going to have to be cut at a unique bevel to match the angle that our side panels would line up on the side of the rib. Man, that was a confusing way to say that, but hopefully you get the picture. So in order to match this bevel, I just did it with my good old eyeball and a ruler, trying to match the same angle of that tacked on scrap piece of 1/4 inch material. Once we had all of our angles figured out, we pulled our scrap piece of 1/4 inch bendy wood off and made sure to remove all those 23 gauge brad nails. Then to cut that bevel, I decided the quickest, easiest way to do this would be just to run it through the table saw. We had a flat referencing surface on either side, so I just altered the blade to match that bevel, and I ran it through on each side until we had a nice angled bevel that would match up with our side panels. So I just went slow, changing the angle for each rib as I went, and then we plopped them back into our jig and tacked our little reference bendy piece in place. The angles all lined up, and that bendy piece was flush with the side of each rib. Next, we had to determine where to cut our next angle on each rib. As you can see, we bent another piece of scrap wood onto the outside just to kind of figure out the overall shape that we were looking for with this boat. Once we had a shape that we liked, I went through with a pencil and I marked on each one of the ribs where we needed to cut it down towards the bottom of the boat. I don't really know if this is how you're supposed to build a boat, but you do what you gotta do when you're building a boat in 5 days. Once all those lines were marked, we pulled off all of our little reference strips, removed all of our 23 gauge nails so that we wouldn't trip the breaker on the saw stop, and then I used a ruler to trace out exactly the shape that each rib would now need to be. This is where things got a little tricky because just like the sides of those ribs, the bottom angle also needed a unique bevel so that it would match the panels that we will eventually put onto the outside of the boat. So to cut this bevel, I just simply used some double-sided tape and a large piece of plywood. I'd tape each piece onto the larger piece of plywood that could ride against the fence on the table saw, and I'd adjust the blade accordingly to get that unique bevel onto each unique rib. It took a while to maneuver all the pieces on and off of my scrap piece of ply, but it was a nice, safe way to get a uniform bevel onto each individual rib. And in no time, we had all the ribs done. The next morning, we had to figure out a way to hook all the ribs together and lock them in place. So after a lot of conversation and a little standing and staring, we decided the best thing to do would be to make a half-lapped spine on the top and bottom of the boat that would connect all the rib pieces. So I pulled out my router and track, and I cut the first lap in our half-lap joint on the top and bottom of each individual rib, just using a 3/4 inch bit, and the spine will hopefully be made out of 3/4 inch ply. So I went slow, I took my time, and I cut all of those laps. While I did that, Mike traced out the internal part of each rib that we will be cutting out. We're going to remove a lot of material here to lose some weight and hopefully make a space inside the boat that we can slide our little feet. Once we had all the half laps cut on the bottom, see the boat's upside down on the table right now, so that's why I'm saying the bottom, even though it looks like the top. Anyways, we took a large scrap piece of 3/4 inch ply and we slid it in place. Now you can clearly see it fits fine in the back but not the front, so we're going to have to do a little transformation to this piece in order to get it to sit down in all of those half laps. The way we did this was simple math. We took a tape measure and we measured up from the top of each rib, and we just followed that arc along and taped a little bendy piece of scrap wood as we went that gave us the overall shape we needed. Then we traced that shape onto the piece of 3/4 inch ply, and I cut out that arc with a jigsaw, making sure to leave enough room for us to cut corresponding laps in this piece that would slip into our half lap. Once the shape was cut, we slid it back into place just to make sure that we were on the right track, and wouldn't you know, it fit almost perfect on the very first try. I say almost perfect because it didn't quite fit perfect. It did need just a little bit of adjustment. So Mike kept tracing out the internal parts of the ribs while I cut it down a little bit more. Then we test fit the whole thing one more time, and yes, you're ready for it. Boom goes the dynamite. It slid in exactly where it needed to be. So with that piece in the correct location, we added a few spacer blocks in between each rib so that it would be spaced uniformly from bow to stern. Then with our spacer blocks in place, all we had to do was take a straight edge and transfer the line from our rib onto that little spine thing we made and cut our corresponding half laps. Now, this piece was so small I didn't feel comfortable using the router and the track, so I just cut out these laps the old-fashioned way with the jigsaw. I went slow, and in no time I had all the laps cut out, and it was time to fit it for the final time to make sure it all slid down where it needed to go. And because we're amazing 5-day boat builders with crazy good skills, it slid in perfectly. Actually, it's because we're extremely lucky. There's a lot of things in this build that just happened to work out when they probably shouldn't have, so kudos to us for our ridiculous good luck.
This video was sponsored by Bespoke Post. Now, Bespoke Post is a monthly subscription service that, well, they send you awesome stuff every month. I've been a member for a while, and the stuff they keep sending, it's just great. One of my last boxes, I got this sweet Damascus steel knife that I use all the time for stabbing packages and opening mail, but you could also use it to whittle yourself a walking stick. And in the last box, I got this sweet mini wooden keg that is very handy for using to age your own liquor. You basically pour clear grain alcohol in here, let it sit as long as you want, and it comes out brown and delicious. But I just got some new boxes from them. Let's open them up and see what's inside. This is the Terra box. It comes with all sorts of things for the outdoorsman. You get a bar of Baselite Grooming Detox Scrub. It smells amazing. Ooh, and a bird call. But the coolest thing in this box is the ultimate tool. This thing is sweet. It can dig, it can cut, it can carve, it can open bottles. I'm gonna use this thing out in the garden, and it's gonna be super handy. You can use it for things like cutting off ripe tomatoes, digging up weeds, whacking down stalks of rhubarb. It is a very handy ultimate tool. The other box I got, and possibly my favorite box to date, is the Dram box. If you like cocktails, if you like drinking, this is the box for you. You get a set of jumbo ice balls. If you've watched any of my cocktail videos, you know how important good ice is, so this is an awesome one. They're little molds that you can make perfectly round spears of ice so your drink doesn't get too watery too soon. It comes with some cocktail recipes, a book, whiskey, the field guide, which I've read and is fantastic. You get a few rocks glasses and some traditional old-fashioned cocktail syrup. The awesome thing about these boxes is that there's around $70 worth of merchandise in each box, but you only pay $45 a month, and you only really pay what you want. Every month before they send out the box, they'll send you a preview of what's inside, and you can decide to get the box, you can swap it out for other stuff, you can skip that month altogether at absolutely no cost. So it's super customizable. So if you want to sign up, and if you want 20% off your first box, use the coupon code MOTH20 at checkout, or you can go to bspk.me/MOTH20 and get 20% off your first box.
So while I tinkered a little bit more with our spine just to cut it to the perfect shape, Mike started cutting out all the internal parts of the ribs. Like I mentioned, this is going to lose quite a bit of weight, which we want for the boat, as well as give us an internal void to hopefully slide our feet into and make it possible to sit in this thing. It looked something like this. Sure, this would have been much easier with a CNC, but we ain't got time for no CNC. We're building a boat in 5 days, people. And as he did that, I built a second spine for the top of the boat. Remember, the boat's flipped upside down, so right now the top is the bottom and the bottom is the top.
That's really good. That's ridiculous. That never happens.
It's like that on.
I mean, you can almost just glue that up right there.
You really can see light through it.
I cut that with a jigsaw.
Well, I was obviously very pleased with myself. Now having the bottom rib and the top rib done, Mike cleaned up all of our internal cutouts with a roundover bit, just so we wouldn't get any splinters in our ankles. While he did that, I had the annoying task of cutting out all of our chine notches in every corner of our rib. Now, I learned from my past boat building experience that the chines are support pieces that sit on each corner of your rib and give you a surface area to attach your side pieces to. Now, each one of these also had a unique angle, so cutting them by hand just seemed like the best thing to do. Speaking of surface area to attach plywood to, we made this spine out of 3/4 inch material, and there was going to be a seam right down the middle, and 3/4 of an inch just isn't that much surface area to attach plywood to. So we decided to add a 1/2 inch piece on either side of that spine to bring the overall thickness to 1 3/4 inches. This was super easy. We just cut a bunch of scrap pieces of 1/2 inch Akume plywood, and using some Total Boat Thixo pre-thickened epoxy, we slapped them on there and tacked them in place until the epoxy dried. We purposely made these extra large, overhanging on the top and bottom, because we knew we could use that pre-made spine in the middle as a template to clean them up over on the router table. So once we had all of our external each side brace pieces, whatever you want to call them, slapped on there with epoxy, it looks something like this. Ooh. Then we took them over to the router table, and using that same flush cut, upcut, downcut bit, we just used that internal spine as our template and cleaned the entire thing up on both sides. And for what felt like the 28th time, we reinserted that spine back in between all of our ribs just to double check that it would fit the way it needs to before we glue the whole thing together. And what do you know, it fits great, and I think, although I don't know because we don't know what we're doing, I think we're ready to start gluing this whole rib system together. To glue it together, we're using Total Boat's Thixo epoxy. This was a huge lifesaver because we didn't have to mix a bunch of epoxy in cups. It just comes in a tube like caulking. So we squeeze it out, it mixes together in the tip, and it's the quick cure, so it hardens in like an hour versus 8 hours or something of traditional epoxy. So we just started squirting it in every individual joint and plopping things together. As you can see, Mike there is measuring the distance from the table to the corner of each rib as we go to make sure that everything is nice and even and there isn't some sort of twist as we work our way down towards the bow of the boat. Once we get one piece in place, we plop it in, and then we added some clamps onto our jig to hold it nice and secure while we worked on the rest of the boat. Once we got everything glued into our top rib, well, then we moved on to the bottom rib. Remember, the top is the bottom and the bottom is the top because the whole thing's flipped over. I don't know if I've said that yet. I want to make sure you guys are aware because I don't want you to think I'm saying something weird because I'm saying the top when we're really working. Anyways, you get it. We put our bottom rib in place. Ta-da! After gluing our bottom spine into all of our ribs, we added a little more of that Thixo epoxy to the end, and just using a few stainless steel fasteners, we screwed it right to the transom. Stainless steel is great for boats because it won't rust or discolor over time. With all of our ribs and spines glued up, it was time to start inserting our chines. Now, on my other boat, I used hardwood for the chines. But this boat has such a drastic spin and twist and curve to it, I wasn't confident we could get hardwood to bend without using steam, and we obviously don't have time for that with a 5-day boat build. So our solution was to make each chine out of 2 pieces of 1/2 inch Akume ply. and put one piece in and then basically just laminate another piece on top. I was confident this would be plenty strong because you're basically making a giant 1" by 1" glue lam piece for your chine. So that's got to be pretty darn solid. So after inserting a little Thixo into each one of those chine notches, I just tacked it in place with a 16 gauge staple gun. That's right, staples. And just wait, because you're going to see a lot of staples used in the building of this boat. After stapling one piece in, glued to each one of those ribs, we spread out a thick coating of the Thixo epoxy on the outside of our first piece, and I stapled in the second piece. I was just adding staples into each one of those ribs so that it was held nice and secure. But then we came back through with a few of the Rockler bandy clamps, and we clamped them on to all the places that didn't have staples, you know, just for good measure, to make sure everything was pulled together nice and tight while we waited for that thickened epoxy to dry. Then after doing one side, we flipped over to the other side and did the exact same thing. Because when it comes to building a boat, what you do on one side, you must also do to the other side. It's just kind of the way things go. So we smeared some more epoxy and we stapled the whole thing together. And if you thought that was it for the chines, well, you are mistaken, because there's chines in the bottom of the boat and there's chines in the top of the boat. So after doing the bottom, we switched to the top chines. Remember, the top is the bottom and the bottom is the top because the boat's flipped upside down. I'm sure you guys are really sick of me talking about that by this point. But anyways, we did the exact same thing we did on the bottom to the top. A little thickened epoxy and a lot of staples, and boom, we had some glue laminated 1" thick chines on all of our seams, followed up with those handy dandy bandy clamps. We called it quits after that for the night, and we came out the following morning. Our epoxy was good and dry, and we started removing all of the clamps. We were both pretty excited because this was going to be the first time that we could actually pick this thing up and see how well it's held together. And what do you know, it is nice and solid and surprisingly very, very light. I would guess it maybe weighed 20 pounds at this point. There's just not a whole lot of material there once we cut out all the interior part of each one of those ribs. So with our chines glued in place, it was time to start shaping it a little bit more. Now at this point, all of our chines just kind of come to a point at the end, but they're not hooked together. So I had to figure out a way to tie all of the chines at the bow of the boat into one solid piece. So I found this piece of solid stock. I think it's honestly black walnut, but it was a nice thick square, so I figured, what the heck, why not use it? And I cut it into this little wedge over on the table saw. Then using a multi-tool and a handsaw, I cut back the front piece of plywood on the bow of the boat. Then I took my little pre-cut solid walnut wedge thing and I added a dado to the back of it so it could slide perfectly over that front piece of plywood and give us a surface to glue all of those front chines to, and then sand flush into a nice point. It looked something like this. And yes, again, we are using more Thixo epoxy from Total Boat. I'm not gonna lie, pretty much the entire boat is held together with just Thixo epoxy. But this stuff is crazy strong and dries really hard, so I think we're in good hands. After gooping up that front piece with a crazy amount of thickened epoxy, I slid it in place. Now all we had to do was figure out a way to clamp this together until all of that epoxy dried. Enter Michael with a crazy amount of tuck tape. Tuck tape is like ducting tape that's usually used for ducting and things like that, but it's been made very popular in the last few years for working with epoxy because it will not stick to cured epoxy. So you can put it on, let the epoxy cure, and then just pull it off. While we waited for the glue to dry, Mike started sanding down the entire frame, getting things nice and flush. And next we had to figure out our cockpit. Now, we purposely designed this in a way that we would have to cut the cockpit out after the fact. We figured that would be the strongest and simplest way to get everything glued up initially. So then we started trying to lay out the cockpit, and the only thing that made sense was to measure Mike's arms to try and make sure there was enough room inside there to hold a steering wheel. Well, it turns out Mike's got an enormous wingspan and that wasn't going to work. So we just picked a random dimension and decided to go with it. We kind of went back and forth on the best way to cut these ribs out and finally decided just a handsaw, nice and slow, was probably going to be the easiest, most accurate way. So I just worked my way from rib to rib and very carefully cut 2 of our 6 ribs out on the top to give us a nice space to make a little seating area, cockpit, captain's pad, whatever you want to call it. All that really matters is that there is enough room for a human being to climb in, sit down, and steer the vessel. So, of course, the only way to determine this was to climb in, sit down, and imagine what it would be like to, well, steer the vessel.
Yeah.
Yep, after my rigorous scientific experiments, I determined that this cockpit would be plenty big for a human being to sit down and steer such a vessel. So we started cutting some plywood to brace our cockpit area. We added a piece of 1/4-inch ply extending front to back on either side, and then we remembered that we had to add a piece to the transom to make it a little thicker. This was so that it would be thick enough to hook our outboard motor onto. But this worked out great because we were able to cut a little notch into that transom piece that allowed our support pieces to slide into and be held nice and secure. I just cut this little notch quick and easy with the jigsaw, and our pieces fit exactly as they should. We then lubed up that back transom support piece with a crazy amount of thickened epoxy and spread it out with putty knives. Then just clamped it on, tacked it a few places with staples to hold it until the glue dries, and cleaned up the back with a flush cut bit. Quick and easy, boat goes breezy. That one was not my best work. I apologize. But anywho, with our transom glued up and waiting for it to dry, we started hooking in the support brace pieces for our cockpit. Just with thickened epoxy and, you guessed it, some staples. I mean, the staples are kind of beside the point. They're really just to hold the pieces in place until that epoxy dries up. Like I said, we're literally holding this entire thing together with epoxy. But I think it'll work. What do we know? While we waited for that to dry, we got a special package in the mail from West Marine. We got online and we ordered a steering wheel kit. Now supposedly, everything in this box will allow us to retrofit our outboard motor to hook into a steering wheel so that we can be faced forward and steer and not have to turn around and hold on to the little arm that comes off the outboard. So we needed a dashboard on which to mount our steering column. So we traced out a shape that we thought looked good, and I cut it out real quick over on the bandsaw. Remembering that we don't have time for really fancy details because we're trying to build a flippin' boat in 5 days. So once we got a shape that looked somewhat like a dashboard and we're sure that it fit in place the way that it should, I pulled it back out and I drilled out the holes that would allow us to mount our steering column. There was a template that came with the steering column on a little piece of paper, so I just traced it out and drilled the holes over on the drill press. And then, yeah, just in case you were wondering, we glued it in place with some more thickened epoxy and a staple gun. Because that's how you roll when you're building a boat in 5 frickin' days. At this point, our entire frame rib assembly was pretty darn close to being done. There was just a little cleanup work. So Mike hit it with a sander while I hit it with a block plane, and we cleaned up the entire top the best we could, just so that all of our seams were nice and smooth and had a good transition. When we were done with the top, we flipped the entire thing over and started working on the bottom. It's going to get confusing again because we're going to flip it over and the top is going to be the bottom and the bottom is going to be the top. But I promise I'm not going to bore you with all those details. I'm just assuming that this little clip right here is enough to show you that now, wait for it, yep, Jason, you're super strong. The top is once again the bottom and the bottom is once again the top. You got that? All right, ready and go. Now, out of all the sanding we had to do on this vessel, the bottom was probably the trickiest because not only did we have to sand the chines, we had to sand them at an angle to match each rib, which means we kind of had to alter our sanding angle in a twisting pattern as we went along from the bow to the stern. But I pulled out the Rotex with a little 40 grit sandpaper and made quick work of it. Is this the right way to build a boat? Probably not, but I'm tired of guessing what the right way is. We're just trying to get this done in 5 days. When I got to the bow, I just used a pole saw to cut off the last remaining chunk of that stock bow piece I put on, and then grabbed the Rotex once again and smoothed it all out. We were just trying to get a nice, smooth transition from bow to stern on which to eventually lay our plywood top and bottom pieces. And in no time, we had a beautiful looking skeleton, framework, rib thing of a boat. But whatever we had, it was looking like something, and it wasn't bad for only 2.5 days work. Now obviously we don't have enough time to show you the rest of this build, so you have to come back next week for part 2.
Yeah, I know. That was a lot of work. And that was only like 2.5 days. So come back next week for the continuation of this series, part 2, where hopefully we can finish this flipping thing and get it in the water. And let me tell you, we do get it in the water and it's pretty nuts. So you're not gonna wanna miss that one. Subscribe down below, hit that little ding notification bell, and that will alert you when the next video comes out. You can also check out the video description for links to products, plans, well, not plans for this boat because we made it up as we went along, but there are plans to some of my more thought out pieces of furniture in that video description. There's also a link to Patreon if you want to support my page over there and get to watch all these videos early. And don't forget to check out Michael Alm's YouTube page where he's also putting out a video of this exact same project. So if you want a different point of view or maybe the true side of the story, go over to his page and watch that video. All right, until next time.